This Sicha, in addition to being a Sicha on Parshas Mishpotim, is also a Siyum on Masechta Baba Basra, both Bavli and Yerushalmi. So in the end of Masechta Baba Basra, in the very last Mishnah, the Mishnah says, an Orev, which means a guarantor, which is written on the shtar, on the document of the particular loan, he's written after the signature of the witnesses, which means the guarantor came along only after the document was already signed. So if the person, the creditor, wants to collect from this guarantor, he will only be able to collect from what's called nechasim b'nei chayrin, assets that are free, that are available, not things that this guarantor would have sold, which are called nechasim mishubodim, which we know that for a loan, usually if a person sold something after he took the loan, so in many cases, the creditor will be able to collect from those things as well. So that's what the Mishnah is saying, that such a guarantor in this type of case would only be able to take from the nechasim b'nei chayrin, he'll be able to take from the guarantor only things that he actually has available. In fact, a story like this once happened and came in front of Rabbi Yishmael, who paskened exactly like this, who ruled that the creditor could collect from the guarantor, but only from his available assets. Ben Nanos said to Rabbi Yishmael, he said that that's not right. In this case, the creditor would not be able to collect from the guarantor at all, neither from nechasim mishubadim, nor from nechasim b'nei chayrin. So Rabbi Yishmael asked Ben Nanos, why is that? So Ben Nanos replied, he said, consider the following case. Imagine if someone is strangling somebody else in the marketplace because he owes him money. A third party comes along and says, leave him alone, I will pay you. Clearly, this person that came along now to save the fellow that's being strangled is clearly not going to have to pay money. Because originally, when the person had lent this fellow the money, it wasn't based on the trust of this new person that just came along. Rather, what would be considered a guarantor that would be obligated to pay? It's only if he was there right from the beginning of the time when the loan was about to happen, and he said, you lend him the money and I'll pay you. That's when he'll be obligated to pay, because then he actually lent him based on his trust. That's the Mishnah. The Mishnah then concludes that Rabbi Yishmael made the following comment. He said, someone that wants to become wise should be learning with monetary dinim. Because there's no subject in Torah that's greater than monetary laws to build your wisdom. They are like a spring, like a fountain that's constantly flowing. And then he said, and someone that wants to learn Dinei Mamonos should serve under Shimon ben Nanos. In other words, he should learn from him. In other words, he was complimenting Reb Shimon ben Nanos's way of learning. Now, regarding this machloikas in the Mishnah, what Rabbi Yishmael said first, and then what Ben Nanos argued, the Gemara says, Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Even though Rabbi Yishmael complimented and praised Ben Nanos, nevertheless, the halacha remains actually like Rabbi Yishmael. Then the Gemara continues, and the Gemara asks the following question. Rabbi Yishmael originally said his halacha only in the case of the guarantor that signed under the signature of the witnesses. The guarantor said that he's taking upon himself this loan. What would Rabbi Yishmael actually say in the case that Ben Nanos had brought up, in this case of a person being strangled? What would he say then? And the Rashbam explains the two sides of what he might say. Perhaps we could say that because his friend is right now being strangled, so he's wholeheartedly, completely accepting upon himself this loan. Or we could say, no, he's just trying to save the person from choking, and he's just doing a mitzvah by trying to save him, but he didn't actually make the original lender lose any money, and therefore he's not a guarantor. So the Gemara continues and says, to prove what Rabbi Yishmael would say, The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yishmael, in fact, did argue in the case of someone being strangled, meaning that also in the case of someone being strangled, Rabbi Yishmael would be of the opinion that this new party is considered a proper guarantor. The Gemara asks, so is the halacha like Rabbi Yishmael also in the case of someone being strangled or not? And the Gemara says, Tashma, that when Ravin came and said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yishmael argued with Ben Nanos, also in the case of someone being strangled, and in fact the halacha is like Rabbi Yishmael, also in the case of someone being strangled. Nevertheless, the Gemara concludes and says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chanuk, if a person is being strangled and this other person comes along, and if the kanu miyoda, if a kinyan was made, if a proper kinyan, in other words, he did an act of a kinyan, and it wasn't only a verbal commitment, but he actually did a certain act that's considered a kinyan, that's when he becomes obligated, which the Gemara says that from this we derive that in a normal case of an orev, you wouldn't need a kinyan. And then the Gemara concludes and says, V'hilchasa, the bottom line halacha is, that if the guarantor was there originally when the money was being given in the first place, then a kinyan would not be needed. But if the orev comes along after the money has already been given, that's when a kinyan must be done. Which means that in the case of chanuk, in the case of someone being strangled, and he's telling the person that you let go of him and I will pay, the only time he'll be obligated is if he also took a kinyan. And this is the ending of the Gemara in Bavli. Now the Rebbe turns to the Yerushalmi. The Gemara says something very similar. Rabbi Yesa says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that even though Rabbi Yishmael praised Ben Nanos, he was only praising him on his way of his thought process, his way of expounding, his way of learning. But the halacha is not like Ben Nanos. Then the Gemara says, Shimon Barva says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that also in the case of a chanuk, even in the case of someone being strangled, the halacha would be like Rabbi Yishmael, which again would mean that even in the case of being strangled, this person coming along would have accepted upon himself the loan. However, the Yerushalmi does not bring the statement of Shmuel that's brought in the Bavli, that when is considered a proper acceptance of this loan, it's only if he took a kinyan, as the Gemara said in Bavli. The Yerushalmi doesn't say that. The Yerushalmi also does not bring the conclusion of the Bavli that the halacha is that the orev only counts as a proper guarantor and doesn't need a kinyan only at the time of the giving of the money, but later after the giving of the money you would need a kinyan. Instead, the Yerushalmi finishes with the following statement. Now we're going to read the statement first only the way it says it in its original text. I'm not going to translate it yet, because we're going to see that some of the Mefarshim of the Yerushalmi explain it in one way, read it in one way, and the Rebbe is going to ask some questions on it and eventually learn Pshat differently. So, Amar Rabbi Yosi, V'at shema minei, barnash davet tzayid l'chavrei b'shuka, osochad v'mar shavkei v'no yohev, minahan gave u'minahan loy gave. So I'll just translate the simple words, but not yet explaining exactly what it means. Rabbi Yossi says, from here you derive that a person that trapped or ambushed his friend in the marketplace, and a person comes along and says, leave him alone and I will pay, from this one he will collect, and from this one he won't collect. What's Rabbi Yossi actually saying? So the Pnei Moshe, one of the classic commentators on the Yerushalmi, says that Rabbi Yossi is actually saying this statement in a way of a surprise. This is like a question, like how can you say this? Which is, Rabbi Yossi is saying, if you will accept that the halacha is like Rabbi Yishmael in the case of chanuk, in the case of someone strangling someone else, then what comes out of this is, what seems to come out is, that when a person is ambushing his friend in the market, he brings the Lashon, a pasuk, this word tzayid based on a pasuk, that it means ambushing. and another person comes along and says, leave him alone and I will pay you. So then Rabbi Yossi is saying that means that the malva, the lender, is going to be collecting not from the borrower, but rather he's going to be collecting from this new third party. How could you possibly say that? The question is, how did he become the one to owe him if all he meant was only to save this guy? And he thought he's just doing a mitzvah by saving him. According to this pshat in Rabbi Yossi, according to this pirush, we would then say that the conclusion in the Yerushalmi is identical to the conclusion in the Bavli, as another Mefarish, the Mari Haponim, points out, which is that in the case of Chanuk and the case of strangulation, the halacha is not like Rabbi Shmuel, who would say that the person is just obligating himself even without a kinyan. And the same thing over here, Rabbi Yossi is saying that how could you possibly say that this person coming along should just suddenly be the one owing the money? Says the Rebbe, however, it's very, very difficult to explain Rabbi Yossi and Yerushalmi in this way. Why? Because even if we should say that the halacha in fact is like Rabbi Shmuel, and that the person that's saying leave him alone is obligating himself fully in the debt, but why would we then say, as the Pnei Moshe is explaining Rabbi Yossi to say, why would we then say that he obligated himself to such an extent that he's completely now, as if he is the one that owes the money, that the creditor, the lender, is going to collect the money specifically from him and not from the borrower, as the Pnei Moshe is explaining this surprise or wonder of Rabbi Yossi, and not, as it sounds simply in this whole sugya, that his obligation is just like a guarantor. That means that the debt is still on the original borrower, and first the lender needs to go to him, as it says clearly in the Mishnah, the dinim of how it works with a guarantor, and only if he doesn't have, then you go to the guarantor. The way the Pnei Moshe learned the words of Rabbi Yossi is saying is that how does it make sense that he should be first going to the guarantor, to this third party that's trying to save the borrower? Furthermore, says the Rebbe, according to the pshat of the Pnei Moshe, this surprise of Rabbi Yossi is based on, as we said, because all he was trying to is save this guy. If that's the pshat, then that's exactly what Ben Nanos originally said in the Mishnah. Ben Nanos originally said in the Mishnah the same point, that if a person is strangling somebody else in the marketplace, and then a third party comes along, how can you suddenly say that this third party is obligated in anything? If that's the case, then what did Rabbi Yossi add to what Ben Nanos said? Then he seems just to be repeating what says in the Mishnah. And therefore, says the Rebbe, it makes more sense to say, it's more logical to say, that Rabbi Yossi in the Yerushalmi is not coming to disagree with what's said before and saying it as a surprise, but rather he's actually coming as a continuation to what's said before. He's trying to actually acknowledge and confirm that the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, also in the case of strangulation. Meaning to say that he holds like Rabbi Shmuel, that if a person is coming to save someone else, then this third party would actually be obligating himself. But Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain why. Why is the halacha over here by a chanuk that he's obligating himself even without a kinyan? Which is, Rabbi Shmuel originally doesn't mention anything again about a kinyan. Again, in the Bavli came along and said that the halacha would be that it's only with a kinyan that he obligates himself. But Rabbi Shmuel never said that. So Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain why, in fact, he obligates himself without a kinyan. Which means to say, different to what we said originally, that it would sound like the Yerushalmi is saying the same thing like the Bavli, according to the Pnei Moshe. The Rebbe is saying, no. According to Yerushalmi, the conclusion is not like the Bavli. Which is, in the Bavli we said that a person that tells the other guy to leave him alone and I'll pay, so it's only going to work with a kinyan. The Yerushalmi, however, is of the opinion that it's going to work even without a kinyan. We'll soon explain why that is and how Rabbi Yossi is saying that. But, says the Rebbe, the idea could be explained based on the idea that really the machloikas between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, whether an orev, a guarantor, after the money has been given already, like in the case of strangulation, whether a kinyan is needed, is really a general machlokes to understand how it works that the guarantor even becomes obligated generally. What does it mean that the guarantor is now suddenly obligated in paying the loan? So we're first going to have a look at that. In regards to the idea of an orev of a guarantor at the time the money was given, in other words, a proper regular guarantor, Rav Ashi explains in the Gemara that how does he become obligated? It becomes obligated because of the hana, because of the pleasure that the orev, that the guarantor gets from the fact that this lender is trusting him. Simply this means, and this is the way it sounds, it's also is implied by a number of poskim, simply the way it sounds is that the hana that he, the guarantor, is getting from being trusted, that's enough to accomplish that he now is fully obligated. That's the way it sounds simply. However, in the Nemuke Yosef, at the end of the Masechta, when he's discussing the concept of a guarantor at the time of giving the money, so he explains it different. He says the fact that he can become obligated without a kinyan is because the lender had given out his money because of him, because of the guarantor. The lender had spent his money. He explains it even more in a previous sugya in the Gemara, where he explains that even though there's no kinyan, all he did was a verbal commitment. Nevertheless, he becomes obligated because the lender could say to him, if not for you, I would have never lent the money at all to this person. Very similar to this says also in the Rabbeinu Gershom at the end of Masechta, that the lender could say to him, if not for you, I would have never spent my money. I would have never given out my money. Now, how does this work together with what Rav Ashi said? Rav Ashi said something else. He said because of the pleasure that the orev got, that's why he's obligating himself. The Nemuke Yosef seems to be saying something else, because of the fact that this guy spent money because of him. Says the Nemuke Yosef that all Rav Ashi was saying is that because he has this pleasure, that's why it's not considered an asmachta. So just to clarify this point, that it doesn't go into it so much of it, but just to clarify very briefly. Regarding many sorts of things in halacha, will say a person obligates himself in regarding a certain thing. In some cases, we'll say it's not considered an obligation because it was only an asmachta. What does an asmachta mean? Asmachta means that a person took upon himself an obligation based on a certain condition, which in his own mind he thought is never ever going to happen. And that's why we say he never really committed it, because he thought that the condition will never take place. So really the same problem could be over here. You could say about the orev, about the guarantor, that he took the obligation upon himself, but in his mind he was sure that he's never going to have to pay, that the other person will pay. So why isn't it an asmachta? So that's where, according to the Nemuke Yosef, that's the pshat where Rav Ashi says that because of the pleasure that he got, that this lender is trusting him, so that's why it goes out of the category in asmachta. We say no, it's a real commitment. But even with a real commitment, you still would theoretically need a kinyan. And this is what the Nemuke Yosef is saying, that the kinyan is happening. Why don't you need a kinyan? Why is it a complete obligation anyways? That's because of this other reason, because the malva spent money because of you. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we can now really look at the whole idea of an orev, of a guarantor obligating himself without a kinyan. We could explain that in two ways. Again, the two ways are going to be, the Rebbe is going to elaborate just briefly first. The two ways are going to be the way we initially understood the Gemara without the Nemuke Yosef, that it's just based on the idea of pleasure, or it's going to be based on the idea of because he spent money. So the Rebbe says, one way of understanding it, I'm going to start with the second one first. One way of understanding it is that the obligation of the orev, of the guarantor, is primarily not because of any hana that he got, any pleasure that he got, but rather because the lender spent money because of him. In other words, the orev, this guarantor, caused that the malvez now doesn't have his money. And the Rebbe says, as it's understood from the Gemara, simply that it doesn't mean that it's because of, we would say that as if he caused them a damage or something like that. In other words, the actual fact that the lender lost money now automatically obligates him. But rather, what we're saying is it's a reason that's why he's obligating himself. In other words, because this person spent money relying on this guarantor. In other words, the malva relied on this person. That's causing that the Arev is now taking upon himself. He realizes that this person is spending money because of me, lent out his money because of me. In that way, he completely obligated himself and said, yes, I will obligate myself completely. And that's why there's no kinyan needed. A second way of learning, and this is again going back, this is the first way, the way we simply understood the words of Rav Ashi, is that no, the obligation of the Arev is specifically because of the pleasure that this person trusted him. Because the Arev is receiving a pleasure, that itself is, so to speak, as if the kinyan, because of this pleasure, he is actually completely, wholeheartedly obligating himself. A practical difference between these two ways of understanding the case, the reason why the Arev obligates himself, will be in the case of the story we were discussing about someone strangling someone else. If the reason for the obligation is because the guarantor caused the lender to spend his money, so then in the case of the chanuk, in the case of the person being strangled, where this new person comes along and says, leave him alone, well, he is not the one that actually made the lender lose his money originally. The lender never gave the borrower money based on this third person. And therefore we would say the lender was never really fully relying on this third party, and therefore this person never really obligated himself completely, and therefore he will only become obligated if he also went ahead and made a kinyan. If, however, we should say that the obligation that the Arev takes upon himself is to do with the pleasure that he gets, so then says the Rebbe, by the person being strangled, and this guy says, leave him alone and I'll pay, so then he is obligating himself. And why is that? Because the actual fact that he is removing the pain of this person that's being choked, being strangled, that itself is a hana that he is now receiving, and because of this hana, he is wholeheartedly obligating himself. Or in the footnote, the Rebbe says another way of understanding the hana is, similar to what we understood the hana in the other case, is the fact that this guy is trusting him and stopping to choke this guy. So that's also a hana, that this person is trusting him, and that's why he's obligating himself. Now back to the Bavli and Yerushalmi. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we could say this is going to be the difference between the conclusion and the Bavli, that even in the case of strangulation, you do need a kinyan. And the conclusion, the way the Rebbe explained to Yerushalmi, that in that case you would not need a kinyan. The Bavli would go according to the way Rabbeinu Gershom and then Mukhe Yosef explained the obligation of the Arev, which is that just saying that person gets pleasure, that's not enough of a reason that the Arev should completely, wholeheartedly commit himself. The most it could achieve is, again, that it's not going to be called an asmachta because of that. But just this sort of pleasure, the fact that he's being trusted, is not powerful enough to cause this shibud, this obligation for the Arev, for the guarantor. So what is the reason for the obligation? Is the fact that practically he caused this other person to spend his money. And therefore, in the case of Chanuk, in the case of the person being strangled, since the bottom line is that the lender never spent the money because of this third person, so there's no reason why he should become obligated. And therefore, the only way he will become obligated is if a kinyan is made. But the sheet of the Yerushalmi is that the reason why the guarantor becomes obligated when the money is the reason why the Arev becomes obligated in the case of when it's right at the time when the loan is happening, is not because of the fact that he's losing his money, but because of the hana that he's gaining, that the person trusted him, and therefore, in the case of strangulation, as we just said, there's also some form of hana that he's happy that this person is no longer being strangled or that the person is trusting him. So you could say a similar idea over here, even though it's after the money was given, but there is this hana, and therefore no kinyan is needed, and he becomes obligated. Now going back to Rabbi Yossi at the end of the Yerushalmi, which we said before, the Rebbe is going to explain it different. Says the Rebbe, this is what Rabbi Yossi is actually coming to explain. When he says, Va'at shma minei, that from this we derive, that Barnash David Tzayid L'chavre, a person that's ambushing his friend in the marketplace, and one person comes along and says, leave him alone and I'll pay. And then Rabbi Yossi says the words from this one he collects and from this one he doesn't collect. What's Rabbi Yossi saying? Rabbi Yossi is saying not that this is the halacha, that he's going to collect only from this third party and not from the borrower. That's not what Rabbi Yossi is saying at all. Rabbi Yossi is explaining why the Orev, why this third person, who's now, so to speak, like a guarantor, why he's becoming obligated. He's saying because what happened is when he said, leave him alone and I will pay, he's now causing, currently at least right now, is that the borrower is not going to bother, going to hurt the loiva. Instead of that, he's going to say, fine, I'll let go of him and I'm going to come to you, at least temporarily. Not that halachically he has more of a right to go to this third person. It's just he's saying, so right now he's going to let go of him and he's happy to go to you to try to get the money from you. So that itself is causing the hana by this third person, by this guarantor, and because of that, he is obligating himself. Says the Rebbe, we can make this all more geschmack, and to explain this, that's really connected with a general difference between the people in Bavel and the people in Eretz Yisrael. This is the way the Rebbe is going to explain the difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. The reason why an Orev completely commits himself and is obligating himself, in other words, when this person does do that, obviously it's going to be connected with mindsets of people, the way people conduct themselves usually, to understand in which situation he will commit himself and which not. It will always depend on the type of people. In fact, as we find in halacha regarding this very issue, so the halacha is brought that if the soichim, if the merchants would usually obligate themselves in this kind of situation, even without a kinyan, not at the time when the money is given, then that's considered a proper minhag. In other words, we have to also understand what's the normal minhag in the place or the mindset of the people in the place. So based on this, says the Rebbe, we can say that the difference between the Bavli and Yerushalmi is really dependent on the mindsets, on the perspectives, on the attitudes of people. And the difference is going to be different in different places in Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. So in order to understand this, the Rebbe starts off by saying that the Gemara says, we know there's a concept that Yidden are guarantors for each other. Kol Yisrael, Arevim Zebozeh, all Yidden become guarantors for each other as far as keeping Torah and mitzvahs. But the Gemara says that this main arvus, this main thing that Yidden are guarantors for each other, started when Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael, when they crossed the Yarden. When they come into Eretz Yisrael, that's when they became all, so to speak, mixed together and united as one. And that's why the Yidden were not punished for what other Yidden did in secret and hiding until the time that they crossed the Yarden. The Ragachover explains this, that when the Yidden become like one unit, not separated from each other, that's why, and that's when this concept of arvus, of being guarantors for each other, works. Whereas when they're not one unit, then there is no arvus. Says the Rebbe, this is the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. The Gemara says, Ein uchlasa b'Bavel, which simply means there's no multitude, or, in other words, Klal Yisrael as a whole, to speak about lots of Yidden together, doesn't really apply in Bavel, as much as in Eretz Yisrael. Which again, quoting the Ragachover, it means they're not considered united or all combined together. And that's why there's a halacha, the Gemara says, Ein tainis tzibur b'Bavel, which has a number of explanations, but the general idea usually means something along the lines that they don't have the power to make a tainis tzibur, to establish a tainis tzibur, at least with the same stringencies as in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, this idea of a community is not as strong in Bavel, or outside of Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael, where there all Yidden become like one tzibur, and therefore once they cross the Yarden, they become like one unit, and that's why there's the idea of arvus, of all Yidden being guarantors for each other. Now, even though, of course, once the Yidden crossed the Yarden and they did accept upon themselves the arvus, then, starting from then on, Yidden are responsible for each other, are guarantors for each other in all times and all places, no matter where they are. And in fact, halachically, we know that's why one Yid can be moitzi another Yid with a bracha for a mitzvah. It doesn't matter which time and place you're in. Nevertheless, from the fact that we said this halach of ein tainis tzibur b'Bavel, because there isn't the proper full gather of a tzibur, that itself tells us that the main shleit, in the most perfect way, of this idea of Yidden being responsible for each other is specifically in Yidden when they're in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, In Talmud Bavli, where again, Bavel is outside Eretz Yisrael, where this arvus, this mixture and guaranteeing for each other, and achdus of the Yidden is not with the same strength. So in Talmud Bavli, they're more lenient to say that if you really want to accomplish arvus, the one Yid should be a guarantor for each other. Of course, here we're speaking now in monetary matters. So then you're going to need what we call a ma'aseh b'poel, an actual action of a kinyan. So either it's going to be when the person is giving the money, so then you'll be able to achieve it even with a verbal obligation, because practically you're causing the person to now be missing his money. Or if it's after the giving the money, when you're not actually causing him to lose any money, but at least then you actually have to do the kinyan b'poel mamash. Whereas the Amoyroim of Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, where Yidden are more in the gather of a tzibur, and therefore they're more mixed together and guarantors for each other and beis achdus. So therefore over there, they view it in a way that the way the Orev takes the responsibility on himself doesn't necessarily have to be through a deed that's mamish, a ma'aseh b'poel in action. It's enough the fact that he gets some sort of pleasure, that's enough already for him to obligate himself because he's so much more united with the other person. The Rebbe says, Al derech ha-musar, and a continuation of what we discussed earlier in Siv Daled, the Rebbe says, when Yidden are in their place, in Eretz Yisrael, in the place where Yidden again are like one unit, they're one whole tzibur, then it's revealed by them, and it's in an open way, that anything that affects another Yid, anything that impacts another Yid, even something that's just a tsar, a little bit of pain, or the like, that itself already causes the other Yid to completely dedicate himself, to completely give himself over, to obligate himself to do anything to take off the tsar of the other Yid, to the extent that that becomes his hana, that becomes his pleasure. He's receiving pleasure from the fact that he removed pain from another Yid, because him and the other Yid are not like two separate people, but rather like one person. And as the Yerushalmi says elsewhere, that two Yidden are like two hands from the same body. Whereas in Bavel, where the achdus of Yidden as one tzibur is not in the same strong way, in an open, revealed way, there we say that in order for one Yid to really obligate himself and give himself over for the other Yid, it's not only when he sees another person a little bit in pain, but it's dafka when there's a real chisarin, the person is actually missing something. Whereas in the case where the person wasn't missing anything, like we said before, that this orev didn't cause the lender to lose anything. So if he sees that no one's missing anything, so then we say, no, that's not going to be enough for him to obligate himself. There has to be a ma'aseh b'poel, an action, begilia, action of a kinyan, which should show that he's actually going to obligate himself for the other Yid. And only then do we say that the malva, the lender, is really ready to accept what the orev is accepting upon himself instead of the loiva. The Rebbe now elaborates what all of this means in Ruchnius, in our Avodah Ruchnius. The Rebbe says it's known, the klal regarding to the three bavos, the three Gemaras, the three Masechtas, Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra. The Gemara says they're really these three Masechtas. They're really initially called Nezikin, and all of them are really one Masechta. It was then divided into three parts, Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra. So there are three sections, or three gates of one Masechta. What is the idea of Nezikin spiritually? Generally, this refers to the idea of Golus. Nezikin means damages. So in the time of Golus, that's where there are the Mazikim, the harmful things from Klippa, which disturb a Yid in his Avodas Hashem. So Masechta Nezikin, the halachas of Nezikin is in Torah, is the learning of Torah that's going to nullify these Mazikim, these harmful things, all these Klippas. And therefore, that's going to cause that the Golus should be nullified and the Geula will come. Says the Rebbe via Shlomo, we can say this is the inner reason why Nezikin is actually set up in three Bavis, because they are corresponding to, as it's understood from the Zohar, the three Geulos, connected to the three Batei Mikdash. And therefore we say all of Nezikin is Chad Masechta is one Masechta. Because as discussed many times, the three Batei Mikdash are not three separate Batei Mikdash, but is the very same Beis HaMikdash that was lost and the Eibishter returns. The Rebbe brings a Rashi about this. On the pasuk Eile Pkudei HaMishkan Mishkan HaEdus, says twice the word Mishkan. Says Rashi, it's a remiss to the Beis HaMikdash that was taken as a mashkan. Mishkan is from the word mashkan, like taken as a security, through 2 Churbanos, which means that the Churban is not that the Beis HaMikdash was completely nullified or gone, but rather it was taken like a mashkan, like a security, which remains complete and whole, is just right now by the lender, and he will return it. So all 3 Batei Mikdash are really one unit. But if the 3 Bavis are corresponding to the 3 Goliyos, Geulos, Batei Mikdash, so we understand that Baba Basra corresponds to this last Golus. And the Rebbe now looks at the difference between the beginning of Baba Basra, the beginning of the Masechta, and the end. The beginning of the Masechta starts off with Hashutfin, partners that wanted to make a mechitza, wanted to make a separation, a division in their courtyard. What does this mean, Beruchnius? The partners are Kavayachal, Hashem, and the Yidden. And the idea of Golus is that there's now, Rahman al-Itzlan, Chas v'Shalom, a separation between these partners. Something happened that separated between the Yidden and Hashem. That's the beginning of the Masechta. Comes along the end of Masechta, meaning the end of the Golus, discusses the dinim of a Oriv, of a guarantor, which hints to the idea of the Achdus, of the unity, of the oneness that's revealed between Hashem and the Yidden. That is, as a result of the inappropriate conduct of Yidden during the time of Golus, the Yidden became, so to speak, Meshubad Rahman al-Itzlan, they became owing to the negative side, to the side of Klippa. But because Yidden are Am Kroive, they are the ones that are close to Hashem, Hashem now becomes the Orev, Hashem becomes the guarantor for the Yidden. He takes upon himself the obligation, so to speak, to give the Yidden all the koiches that are needed to get rid of their obligation to the L'umazet, to the Klippa. Says the Rebbe, this is then the inner explanation of this machloikis between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. It's known that specifically in the end of Golus, the Ikvus of the Mashiach, at the very end of Golus, the darkness is in a much greater way. As the Gemara describes at length, in the end of Masechta Soita, the spiritual and physical darkness at the end of Golus. And here is the remez, that the end of Baba Basra speaks about the din of a chonuk, of someone being strangled. That's the situation, Rahman al-Itzlan, of Yidden at the end of Golus. That the darkness of the Golus is so strong that we feel choking Rahman al-Itzlan, choked up because of the darkness of the Golus. Comes along the Gemara and says, what's absolutely clear, both according to Bavli and the Yerushalmi, that even in the case of Chanuk, even in the case of someone being strangled, the halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel, which is that the Orev, the guarantor, is becoming obligated and we're going to collect from him. Spiritually, what this means is that despite the fact that Midas Hadin, the Midah of judgment, coming from its perspective, there's some room to say that the Yidden need to pay up their debt themselves. The halacha is like Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel is a Kohen, he's a Kohen Gadol, in fact. Kohen is Isha Chesed. In other words, the Kohen Isha Chesed paskins that the Eibishter, the Orev, is obligating himself to the Yidden and pays our obligations, our debts, kavayachol. The difference is only exactly how the shibud becomes, how that obligation becomes. From the perspective of Bavli, where the darkness of the Golus is much stronger, and therefore that achdus, that unity, that arvus between the Eibishter and the Yidden is not so seen so much begili in such a revealed way, we say that a kinyan is needed. That means the Yidden need a demand from the Eibishter, that the Eibishter Shemamish put himself in to the state of the Yidden, to the situation of the Yidden, and to be himself Meshabbat. There's much more of that action needed, asking Hashem to put himself into the situation. Whereas from the perspective of the Yerushalmi, which generally Yerushalmi is more a situation of light, so the partnership between Hashem and the Yidden is also in a brighter and more illuminated way. So all we need to do is just remind Hashem of the pain of his friend. Like in the case of the person being strangled, he's remembering that his friend is in pain. The pain that Yidden are having because of being in the distress and captivity of Golus, which is of course expressed in the fact that the Yidden daven and demand and say Ad Mosai. And as the expression in Slichas that said, Al titnu domile, don't be silent until it'll be established and Yerushalayim will become a glory again in the land. And that's already enough and more than enough that Hashem should obligate himself for Yisrael Am Kroivai and bring immediately the Geula through Mashiach Tzidkenu, which is going to build the Beis HaMikdash, the third Beis HaMikdash, the Basra, the last one, in its place. And as it says, Gadol Yekvoid Abayis Hazar Achron, that this last Beis HaMikdash's glory is going to be much greater than the first one. Or B'meheira V'yameinu Mamash.